Welcome to Nazir Fears, where fear finds you. Do you dare to enter a world of unspeakable horror and chilling mysteries? If you love creepy true stories, urban legends, haunted places, and terrifying experiences, you're in the right place.
Like, subscribe, share, and click that bell icon.
The Lurking Shadows. Mark had always loved fishing. He had grown up on the banks of a quiet lake, spending hours with his father casting lines into the cool, dark water, waiting for a bite. Those summer evenings were some of his fondest memories, where the world seemed to disappear, and all that mattered was the steady rhythm of the water, the hum of insects in the air, and the distant call of a bird overhead. Fishing had always been a way to escape the chaos of life, a chance to reconnect with nature and with his childhood. Now, as an adult, Mark found himself returning to that same lake, drawn by the memories and the need to get away from the stresses of work and the grind of city life. It had been years since he had last fished here, but it felt like home, the familiar scent of the water and the surrounding forest filling his senses. It was a Saturday afternoon when he arrived, the sun high in the sky, the lake calm and serene. He unloaded his gear and set up camp on the shore, his old fishing rod resting comfortably in his hands. The first few hours passed peacefully. Mark cast his line into the water, watching as it sank into the depths, the ripples slowly dissipating. The boat was nowhere in sight, and the only sound was the occasional splash of water and the breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. He felt at peace, as if the world outside the lake no longer existed. It was just him, the water, and the wilderness. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, something shifted. Mark couldn't quite put his finger on it at first, but the air felt heavier. The once calm water began to stir, not with the usual ripple of fish, but with an odd, unsettling movement. It was as though something large was moving just beneath the surface, shifting the water in strange, erratic ways. Mark glanced around, but the forest was silent, no signs of wind or animals stirring. He shrugged it off, convincing himself it was just the water's natural ebb and flow, and perhaps the current from a distant stream. But as the minutes ticked by, the sensation of unease began to grow. The water seemed to churn in a pattern, as if something was swimming beneath the surface, circling his boat. His heart rate quickened, but he tried to push the thought away, telling himself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But then he saw it, a dark shape, just below the water's surface, moving swiftly through the lake. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The shape was large, larger than anything he had ever seen before. It was a shadow, but it was too distinct, too deliberate to be just a trick of the light. Mark stood up from his seat, straining his eyes to get a better look, but the shape disappeared beneath the surface before he could make out any details. His mind raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had heard rumors about the lake, stories told around campfires, whispered by old-timers who had lived in the area for years. Some said the lake was cursed, that something ancient and malevolent lurked beneath its depths. But Mark had always dismissed those stories as local folklore, just tall tales meant to spook tourists and children. Yet now, standing on the edge of the water, the stories didn't seem so far-fetched. Mark cast his line again, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the strange disturbance in the water. The peaceful ambiance of the lake had vanished, replaced by an unsettling feeling that gnawed at him from the inside. He couldn't shake the image of the shadow beneath the water, moving with purpose, as if it was aware of his presence, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the light began to fade, Mark decided it was time to pack up and head home. He wasn't about to let a strange experience ruin his love for fishing, but the feeling of being watched was too strong. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the water, and the temperature dropped. The once calm lake now seemed ominous, its stillness broken only by the distant splashes of unseen creatures. Mark began to gather his gear, but just as he turned to walk back to the shore, he felt it again. A presence. He wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind him. But there was nothing. Nothing except the water and the strange ripples that were spreading across the surface. Ripples that seemed to come from nowhere, growing in size and intensity, as though something beneath the water was stirring, something that wanted to be noticed. He turned back to his gear, hastily packing up his belongings, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had settled over him. But the more he tried to focus on the task at hand, the more he felt the presence around him. It was as if the very lake itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He didn't wait long before he decided to leave. Mark turned and headed toward his truck, the feeling of being followed pressing down on him like a heavy weight. The path to the parking lot was lined with trees, their branches casting eerie, gnarled shadows across the ground. As he walked quickly, his footsteps echoed in the stillness of the night, the only sound besides the occasional rustle of leaves. But then, just as he reached the edge of the woods, a sound broke the silence. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere behind him. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned slowly, scanning the dark trees, but saw nothing. The growl came again, louder this time, and this time Mark could see it. A large, shadowy figure, moving quickly through the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he stumbled back, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He turned and bolted toward his truck, his heart racing in his chest. The sound of heavy footsteps followed him, closer now, the growl of the iku, creature growing louder with each passing second. He fumbled with his keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. He slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he started the engine and sped away. The growling followed him for a few moments, but as he drove down the dark road, the sounds faded into the distance. Mark didn't stop driving until he was miles away from the lake, the terror of the experience still fresh in his mind. His heart was still pounding, his mind racing with questions. What had he seen? What had been following him? And why did it feel so deliberate, so sinister? He never went back to the lake. Every time he thought about it, his mind returned to the shadow in the water, to the growl in the trees. The peaceful fishing trip had turned into something far darker, something that haunted his every thought. Years later, Mark would hear similar stories from other people who had ventured out to that same lake. Strange occurrences, sightings of figures in the water, and the feeling of being watched by something not quite human. Some said it was just the local wildlife. Others claimed it was a trick of the mind. But deep down, Mark knew the truth. There were things in that lake, things that were not meant to be found, not meant to be seen. And whatever it was still waiting. The Ghost of Blackwater Creek. David had always been a skeptic. Growing up, he had heard countless ghost stories, from campfire tales to chilling accounts from local legend. But David never bought into any of it. He believed in logic, science, and the rational explanations behind things that seemed strange. So when he accepted an invitation to go fishing at Blackwater Creek, He did so with the same nonchalance he'd approach any weekend getaway. Blackwater Creek was known among locals as a peaceful place to fish, tucked away in the rolling hills of the Appalachian foothills. Its deep, murky waters had a reputation for holding some of the biggest fish in the area, and many came to cast their lines into its quiet depths. But there were rumors, too, whispers of strange happenings, of a ghostly presence that haunted the creek. Some said they'd seen figures at the water's edge late at night. Others claimed to have heard unearthly whispers carried on the wind. But David didn't pay those stories any mind. To him, they were just that, stories. The day David arrived at Blackwater Creek was warm and still, the sun shining brightly over the dense forest that surrounded the water. He met his friends at the old, run-down cabin that sat on the creek's edge, its windows dark with the absence of life. They greeted him with laughter and light conversation, eager to get out onto the water. The plan was simple: fish, relax, and enjoy the quiet of the secluded creek. As they launched their boat and rowed out into the middle of the creek, the tranquility of the place settled over David. The water was dark and slow-moving, its surface reflecting the tall trees that lined the banks. David cast his line into the water and leaned back, letting the rhythmic motion of the boat and the gentle sounds of nature lull him into a sense of calm. But even in the peaceful setting, David couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air seemed heavier here, denser, as though the forest itself was watching them. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The men joked and teased each other, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a strange silence fell over the creek. The sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed to stretch on for far too long. David, ever the skeptic, shook off the chill creeping up his spine, attributing it to the natural transition of day into night. But then something happened that made him pause, something he couldn't explain. He was sitting at the front of the boat when he noticed a figure standing on the far side of the creek. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was a shadow, darker than the rest of the surrounding trees, standing motionless at the edge of the water. At first, David thought it was just a trick of the light, perhaps a shadow cast by a branch or a patch of darker water. But when he looked again, the figure was still there, impossibly still, as if it were watching them. "Hey guys, do you see that?" David called out, his voice tinged with curiosity. His friends turned to look in the direction he was pointing, but the figure was gone. There was nothing but the still water and the dark forest on either side. They shrugged it off, attributing it to the fading light playing tricks on their eyes. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thicker now, more oppressive. They decided to head back to the cabin as dusk settled over the creek. The boat was rowed back toward the dock, the water growing darker with every stroke of the oars. David kept his gaze fixed on the shoreline, half expecting to see the figure again. But it didn't appear. Still, the sense of unease lingered. When they reached the dock, David was the first to jump out of the boat. As he stood on the wooden planks, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves and carrying with it a faint whisper, a voice low and unintelligible. David froze. It was so faint, he almost thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me," it whispered. David's blood ran cold. He turned toward his friends, but they hadn't heard it. The night had fallen completely now, and the cabin was shrouded in darkness. The only light came from the lanterns hanging by the door, casting long, flickering shadows on the ground. David felt a chill settle over him, the voice still echoing in his mind. "Did you hear that?" David asked, his voice tense. His friends looked at him, puzzled. "Hear what?" "The voice," David insisted, his heart pounding in his chest. "It was a woman's voice. She said, 'Help me.'" But his friends just laughed it off, assuming it was just the wind, or maybe the sound of an animal. David couldn't let it go, though. The voice had been too real, too desperate. Later that night, after a dinner of grilled fish and cold beers, the group gathered around the fire pit outside the cabin. The night was thick with silence, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees. But then, just as David was about to speak again about the voice, he heard something, a soft, slow, scratching sound coming from the far side of the cabin. "Did anyone else hear that?" David asked, his eyes darting around. The others were quiet, listening. The scratching sound continued, like nails dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. "Probably a raccoon or something," one of his friends suggested. But David's mind was racing. It was the same side of the cabin where he had seen the shadow earlier. He stood up and walked toward the sound, his curiosity getting the better of him. The others followed reluctantly, their steps hesitant as they approached the far side of the cabin. As they rounded the corner, David's breath caught in his throat. There, standing in front of the old shed, was the figure again. This time it was clearer, its form more distinct. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothing, her long dark hair hanging over her face. She stood motionless, facing the wall of the shed, her body still and unmoving. David's heart raced. "Hello?" he called out cautiously. The woman didn't respond. She remained still, her head tilted slightly as though she could hear him, but was too far gone to acknowledge him. David took a step forward, but his friends held him back. "Don't go any closer," one of them whispered, fear in their voice. David didn't listen. He moved closer to the woman, his feet crunching on the leaves beneath him. But just as he was about to speak again, the woman turned slowly toward him. Her face was pale, her eyes black as night, and her mouth stretched into a twisted, unnatural smile. "Help me," she whispered again, but this time it was louder, more desperate. David recoiled, his heart racing in his chest, as the woman stepped toward him, her hand outstretched. He backed away quickly, stumbling on the uneven ground. The woman reached out again, but just as her fingers grazed his arm, she vanished, disappearing into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. The air was still once more. David stood frozen, unable to speak, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. His friends stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do or say. The forest around them felt different now, darker, more oppressive. They quickly decided to retreat back to the cabin. But the image of the woman, her twisted smile and black eyes, haunted David long after they were safely inside. That night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, David heard it again. The same whisper, now clearer, louder, more desperate than before. "Help me! Help me!" He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the voice wouldn't stop. It echoed in his mind, growing louder with every passing second. The darkness outside the cabin pressed in on him, and David realized that whatever had been haunting Blackwater Creek was not just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was waiting for him. The Haunting of the Forgotten Boat. Elliot had always been an avid fisherman. Growing up near the coast, he spent every free moment on the water, learning the craft from his father. They would fish together, often venturing far beyond the reaches of the harbor, into the deeper parts of the ocean, where the waters were calmer, the fish larger, and the air fresher. Those days spent with his father were the best of his childhood, filled with laughter, shared memories, and a love of the sea. But now, many years later, fishing had become a solitary pursuit. His father was long gone, having passed away unexpectedly, leaving Elliot with only the memories of their time together on the water. It was on one of these solo fishing trips that Elliot's life would change forever. He had rented a small boat, a modest vessel with just enough room for himself, his gear, and his thoughts. The weather was perfect, cloudless skies, a gentle breeze, and calm waters. He set out early in the morning, eager to find a peaceful spot to fish and escape from the noise of his daily life. The ocean was his sanctuary, and it had always provided him with solace in times of grief. As he rowed further from shore, the familiar sights of the harbor faded into the distance. The boat drifted along with the current, the rhythmic lapping of the water against the hull creating a soothing sound. Elliot set up his rod and cast his line into the water, then leaned back, his eyes closed, letting the peacefulness of the moment wash over him. It had been too long since he'd been out on the water like this, and he reveled in the quiet. The world seemed so much smaller on the sea, as if everything outside the horizon didn't exist. Hours passed without a single bite, but Elliot didn't mind. He wasn't in a hurry. He just wanted to be there, to feel the pull of the water, to reconnect with the memory of his father and their shared love of the ocean. But as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of his eye. Elliot glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing. The water was calm, and the sky was bathed in the soft colors of the setting sun. Then, just as he was about to turn back to his fishing rod, he noticed something strange. In the distance, barely visible on the far side of the bay, was a boat. It was old, abandoned-looking, and drifted aimlessly on the water. It seemed out of place, its wooden frame weathered and worn, its sail torn and tattered. Elliot squinted, trying to make out more details, but the boat was too far away to see clearly. He was about to dismiss it, thinking it was just another wreckage from the past, when the boat seemed to change course, slowly drifting closer to him. Elliot stood up, his curiosity piqued. The boat was moving unnaturally, as if it were being pulled by some unseen force, gliding toward him despite the lack of wind. His heart began to race, and a shiver ran down his spine. The closer it got, the more unsettling it became. The boat seemed too still, too silent, as though no one was aboard, yet it continued to draw nearer with unnatural precision. As it approached, Elliot could make out more details. The hull of the boat was dark with rot, and the deck was cluttered with debris. A thick layer of grime covered the once white wood, and the sails were torn and fluttering like tattered rags in the wind. There was something eerie about it, something that made his skin crawl. It was as if the boat had been abandoned long ago, forgotten by time and the sea. And yet, here it was, drifting closer, almost as though it were looking for something, or someone. Elliot tried to push aside his growing unease. It was just an old boat, probably a relic from some long-forgotten storm. But the feeling that something was wrong intensified as the boat continued to approach. It was now within arm's reach of his own boat. He could see clearly now that there was no one on board. No crew, no passengers, just the wreckage of the forgotten vessel slowly drifting toward him. Without thinking, Elliot reached for his oars and began to row back toward shore. His heart thudded in his chest as the boat came even closer. But as he pulled at the oars, he heard something, faint, almost imperceptible at first. A sound, A whisper, or perhaps the faintest creak of wood. He stopped rowing and listened carefully, but the sound was gone. He glanced over his shoulder again. The abandoned boat was now nearly beside him, the shadow of its hull casting a dark shape on the water. Then he heard it again. This time it was clearer. A voice, a soft whisper, coming from the boat. It sounded like a woman's voice, calling out to him, but the words were unintelligible. His pulse quickened as he realized the voice was coming from the wrecked boat itself. "Help me," the voice whispered. "Help me, please." The hairs on the back of Elliot's neck stood up. His heart skipped a beat as the boat moved closer. The voice now louder, more desperate. He could almost feel it, like a cold breath on the back of his neck, the presence of someone, or something, just behind him. His hand trembled as he reached for his fishing rod, pulling it back into the boat. The whispering continued, the words becoming more frantic, more urgent. "Help me! Get me out of here!" Elliot could feel a chill settle in his bones, and he knew that whatever was on that boat, it wasn't just a lost soul. It was something else, something far more sinister. He started rowing again, faster now, desperation creeping into his movements. But no matter how hard he rowed, the boat seemed to match his pace, staying just beside him, its eerie whisper growing louder with every stroke. In a blind panic, Elliot turned to face the boat. The voice was now a maddening shriek, echoing in his mind. He had to get away. He couldn't stand it anymore. But as he turned to look, he saw something he couldn't comprehend. The boat wasn't empty anymore. There, standing on the deck, was a figure, a woman, her face obscured by dark, wet hair that hung in tangled strands over her face. Her body was gaunt, skeletal, with skin that seemed to have been stripped away by years of exposure. She was standing motionless, staring directly at him, her eyes hollow and empty, but filled with an undeniable, insistent hunger. Elliot froze. The figure raised her hand, pointing directly at him. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. "Help me!" The water around him began to churn, the surface rippling as if the sea itself was coming to life. A wave of cold rushed over him, a force so strong it nearly knocked him out of the boat. His arms and legs grew heavy, as though something was pulling at him, dragging him down toward the dark depths of the water. "Please, help me!" The voice was now a scream, an agonizing cry that filled the air around him. But Elliot couldn't move, couldn't speak. His body was frozen, his muscles locked in place. The figure on the boat began to lurch toward him, her hands outstretched, reaching for him with long, skeletal fingers. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The figure vanished. The water calmed. The boat drifted away into the distance, its haunting whisper fading with it. Elliot sat there in the boat, his heart pounding in his chest, drenched in sweat and trembling uncontrollably. He turned around, but the figure was gone. The lake was silent again, save for the occasional lapping of water against the boat. Elliot didn't wait another moment. His hands shaking, he grabbed the oars and rowed with everything he had, pulling himself away from the spot where the boat had once been. He rowed all the way back to shore, his mind racing, unable to comprehend what he had just experienced. When he finally reached the dock, he didn't look back. He grabbed his things, left the boat behind, and never returned to Blackwater Creek. For weeks, he couldn't shake the image of the woman on the boat, the hollowness in her eyes, and the chilling whispers that still echoed in his mind. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes late at night, he would hear it again, the voice, soft at first, and then growing louder, until it was all he could hear. Help me!
Like, subscribe, share, and click that bell icon.
The shifting sands. Aidan, Jess, and Sarah had always been the adventurous type, seeking out new places to explore and mysterious lands to uncover. So when Aidan found the old beachside cottage, nestled between the high cliffs and the rocky shore, it seemed like the perfect weekend getaway. The quiet, isolated beach was miles away from the nearest town, far from the usual tourist crowds that plagued the coastlines of the city. This was their chance to disconnect, to live simply for a while and escape the stresses of their daily lives. The trio arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the vast stretch of sand that lay before them. The cottage was modest, tucked under the shadow of a towering cliff, with an old wooden fence that creaked in the wind. The air smelled of salt water and earth, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled the otherwise silent environment. A sense of peace settled over them as they unloaded their bags and set up their temporary home. Over the next few hours they explored the beach. The sand was soft and warm, the water inviting but slightly too cold for a dip. The shoreline stretched for miles, the ocean a deep blue, its waves crashing rhythmically against the jagged rocks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the group settled around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and reminiscing about old memories. The glow of the fire flickered across their faces as they laughed, savoring the calm and the stillness of the place. But as the night deepened and the fire burned lower, a strange feeling crept over them. It wasn't immediate, but subtle. Jess, who had always been the most sensitive to changes in the environment, was the first to speak up. "Do you guys feel that?" she asked, looking around the beach, her eyes scanning the darkness. The sky was now pitch black, save for the faint starlight above them. Aidan paused mid-laugh, glancing over at her. "What do you mean? It's just the night settling in. Everything's fine." But Jess didn't seem convinced. She rubbed her arms, her eyes narrowed, as though she was searching for something hidden in the shadows. "I don't know, it's like the air feels heavier, almost like something's here with us." Sarah, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "You're imagining things. It's just the quiet of the beach. No cars, no people, no noise. It messes with your head." Jess shook her head but didn't say anything more. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The night passed in uneasy silence. The wind began to pick up, sending the smoke from the fire swirling, as though pushing it away from the group. Every now and then, they heard the distant sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. But there was something off about it, like the ocean was a little too loud, a little too close. Jess tried to brush it off as just her imagination. But when she closed her eyes, she could have sworn she heard whispers carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable. The next morning, Sarah was the first to wake. She stepped outside the cottage and stood for a moment on the porch, looking out at the beach. The light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the sand. But as she took in the view, something caught her eye. A series of strange patterns in the sand, like footprints, but not human. They were too large, too erratic. They circled back and forth in odd formations, leading toward the cliffs, then disappearing into the distance. She called to the others, but as they arrived, the patterns in the sand appeared even stranger. Aidan crouched down, running his hand over the marks. "Looks like someone, or something, has been walking around," he said, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," Jess said, a chill running down her spine. "These weren't here last night. I'm sure of it." Sarah, trying to calm her nerves, brushed it off. "It's probably just the tide, or some animal running around. No big deal." But Jess wasn't convinced. The patterns felt deliberate, like they had been made by something that wasn't natural. The three of them stood in silence for a few moments, the wind whispering through the trees, until Aiden spoke up. "Well, we're here now. Let's make the most of it. We've got the whole day to explore." Despite Jess's misgivings, the group decided to take a walk along the shore, following the strange patterns in the sand. As they walked deeper into the beach, they came upon a large, weathered rock outcropping. The cliffs towered above them, casting long shadows over the sand. They climbed up to the rock formation, and, from the top, they could see the entire beach laid out before them. The scene looked peaceful from this vantage point, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But then, something caught Sarah's attention. A dark shape, moving along the edge of the cliff. It was hard to make out, but it was definitely a figure. A person or animal, it wasn't clear. The figure moved in jerky, unnatural motions, its limbs swaying oddly. Sarah blinked and rubbed her eyes, but when she looked again, it was gone. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with unease. "See what?" Aiden replied, scanning the horizon. There was nothing there. "I swear I saw something moving along the cliffs," she said, but no one else had seen it. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. The strange feeling from the previous night continued to hang in the air, growing heavier as the sun began to set once again. The group returned to the cottage, their nerves on edge, but no one spoke about the figure they had seen or hadn't seen. That evening, as they gathered around the campfire once more, Jess couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in her chest. The whispers on the wind seemed louder now, more persistent. It felt like the very ground beneath them was shifting, changing, as though the beach itself was alive and watching them. "I don't know how much longer I can stay here," Jess said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "This place, it feels wrong." Aiden tried to reassure her. "You're just tired. It's been a long day, and the isolation is messing with your mind. Just get some rest, and we'll leave tomorrow if you're still not feeling it." But Jess wasn't so sure. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the wind howling outside. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees felt like it was coming from something far worse than nature. It felt like the beach itself was trying to draw them in, pull them deeper into its strange, unknowable depths. In the dead of night, Jess was woken by a sound she couldn't explain, a scraping, dragging sound coming from outside the cabin. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest, and peered out of the window into the dark. The moonlight revealed nothing but the empty beach, the still ocean, and the same distant cliffs. But as she lay back down, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, she heard it again. A scraping, like something heavy dragging across the sand. Slowly, she got out of bed and tiptoed toward the window, her breath caught in her throat. And that's when she saw it. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the firelight, a shadowy figure was moving across the beach, dragging something heavy behind it. The figure didn't walk. It seemed to glide, its movements slow and deliberate. The sound of dragging continued as the figure moved in a circle, back and forth, just like the patterns they had found in the sand earlier. Jess's heart raced as she backed away from the window. She was about to wake the others when the door to the cabin creaked open behind her. Aidan and Sarah stood in the doorway, their faces pale. "Jess?" "We saw it too," Aidan said, his voice trembling. "It's not just in your head. Something's out there." As the night wore on, the wind howled louder, and the figure on the beach continued its slow, eerie ritual. And in the distance, the symbols in the sand began to shift once more, the patterns changing as if guided by an unseen hand. The group realized then, whatever had once lived on this beach, whatever ancient force had called them here, was now awake, and they were trapped in its shifting sands, with no way to escape. The next morning, the beach was empty. The figures, the symbols, everything was gone, like it had never existed. The sand was smooth and undisturbed, as if they had imagined the entire thing. But Jess knew better. As they left, she could feel the beach watching them, and she knew that one day it would call them back. The Drowned Village. Claire had always been fascinated by the sea. Growing up near the coast, she spent countless afternoons walking along the beach, collecting seashells and watching the tide roll in and out. The ocean was vast and mysterious, and no matter how much she learned about it, she felt it always had secrets left to reveal. It was no surprise, then, when Claire, now an adult, decided to spend a few weeks exploring the isolated beaches of an old, forgotten part of the coast. This remote stretch of beach was rarely visited, and local legends told of a sunken village somewhere beneath the waves. But to Claire, it was simply the perfect place to escape and reconnect with the wonders of the natural world. She arrived at the small town by the sea early one morning. The town was sleepy and quiet, with few tourists around. The air was heavy with salt and brine, and the smell of old wood and seaweed filled her lungs as she checked into a small bed and breakfast. The owner, a frail old woman with a weathered face, seemed wary of Claire's arrival. "Not many come here, dear," the woman warned, her voice low and thick with a regional accent. "The village is long gone, swallowed by the sea. Some folks say it's still there, though, buried beneath the waves. But you won't find much here. Just a quiet beach and an old town that used to be." Claire smiled politely. "That's exactly what I'm looking for. Peace and solitude, and maybe a bit of adventure," she added with a playful wink. The woman didn't seem to share her enthusiasm, and Claire couldn't help but notice the faint unease in her eyes. But she brushed it off, thinking it was just a superstitious old woman who was too set in her ways. The next day, Claire set out to explore the beach, armed with her camera and a notebook for documenting anything she found. The ocean was calm, the air cool, and the scent of the sea filled her senses. As she walked along the shore, her eyes scanning the horizon, she saw something strange, an object half buried in the sand. Curious, she knelt down and uncovered an old, rotting piece of wood. It was a fragment of something larger, perhaps part of an old shipwreck or a forgotten piece of the village's past. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized she had stumbled upon a relic. As the days went by, Claire continued her search. The sun would set, casting long shadows across the beach, and the tides would change, revealing more of the buried remnants. Pieces of broken pottery, rusted nails, and the faint outline of stone foundations poked through the shifting sands. But it was what she found on the third day that made her pause, feeling a chill crawl down her spine. Walking along the beach, Claire noticed a pattern in the sand, a series of small indentations leading into the water. The marks seemed too symmetrical to be natural, almost as if they had been carefully arranged. Following them with cautious steps, she reached a point where the sand seemed to give way to something harder. She knelt down and brushed the sand away. What she uncovered was an old stone doorway, half submerged in the ocean. It looked ancient, worn by centuries of water erosion, yet still intact enough to suggest that it had once been part of something much larger. Her heart pounded as she realized she had found a part of the village that had been submerged for years, possibly centuries. Her excitement was tempered by an unsettling feeling, a sense that she was trespassing in a place that had been abandoned for a reason. But curiosity outweighed her fear, and she quickly snapped photos and jotted notes in her journal, her mind racing with questions. That evening she returned to the bed and breakfast, her mind full of the day's discoveries. She was eager to learn more, to find out what had caused the village to sink beneath the waves. But as she sat down to a quiet dinner, the old woman approached her with a grave expression. "You've found it, haven't you?" the woman asked softly, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Claire looked up, surprised by the sudden shift in the woman's demeanor. "The village? Yes, I've found some remnants. It's amazing. But I still don't understand how it all disappeared." The woman leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't the sea that took it. At least, not entirely." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman hesitated, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder before speaking again. "There's a legend, a story passed down by the old ones. They say that the village was built over a sacred place, a place where the sea god's anger was kept at bay. But when the villagers began to take from the ocean without offering their respect, they angered the god. The village sank into the sea as punishment." Claire laughed nervously, thinking it was just another local myth. "You don't really believe that, do you?" The woman's face grew serious, her eyes dark with fear. "You shouldn't be out there anymore. The ocean doesn't forget, and neither do the spirits of those who drowned. I've heard them, voices on the wind, whispers from the deep. They're not at peace, and they'll make sure you aren't either." Claire shook her head, dismissing the woman's warnings. It was just superstition, nothing more. She didn't believe in spirits or gods, only the tangible, the real. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the sea. The wind howled outside, and the waves crashed harder than usual, as though the ocean was angry, as though it wanted to tell her something. The next day, Claire returned to the site of the submerged doorway. The tide had receded, revealing more of the stone structure, and she eagerly waded into the shallow water to get a better look. As she worked to clear more sand from the ancient stones, she felt a sudden shift beneath her feet. The ground seemed to shift, the sand suddenly sinking beneath her, and she stumbled forward, barely managing to catch herself against the cold stone. As she stood there, panting, she looked around. The sky had darkened, and the winds were picking up again. She could hear the faintest whispers, as if the sea was speaking directly to her. Her heart raced, but she pushed on, determined to uncover the mystery of the village. But as the whispers grew louder, a chill settled over her. The water around her feet seemed to rise, inching higher and higher, until it was up to her knees. And that's when she saw them. Shapes beneath the water, moving slowly, almost deliberately. Figures, ghostly pale shapes, like the remnants of people who had once lived in the village, but now only existed in the depths. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her heart pounding in terror. The shapes moved closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She turned and ran, But the water began to rise faster, pulling her toward the sea. The whispers became voices, urgent and angry, calling her name. "Get out!" one voice shouted, its tone pleading, desperate. "Leave! Before it's too late!" another voice hissed, its words dripping with malice. Claire's legs burned as she ran toward the shore, but the water continued to rise, pulling her back toward the ocean. As she reached the safety of the beach, she turned to look back, gasping for air. The sea had claimed its prize, the spirits of the drowned village now awake and furious. The once tranquil beach now seemed hostile, alive with a dark, ancient force. That night, as Claire packed her belongings to leave, the whispers followed her, carried on the wind. The ocean seemed to call her, its voice echoing in the back of her mind, a warning she couldn't ignore. She left the beach the next morning, but the vision of the drowned village, the angry spirits, and the rising tide stayed with her, haunting her dreams. The ocean had reclaimed its secret, and Claire knew she would never return. The lighthouse keeper's secret. Tom had always been drawn to isolation. After years of living in the chaotic buzz of city life, the chance to retreat to a remote island and care for an abandoned lighthouse seemed like a perfect opportunity to reset. The position was simple enough. Maintain the lighthouse, check the beacon, keep the place tidy, and monitor the weather. The pay wasn't extravagant, but for Tom, it was the peace he craved. The lighthouse stood tall and weathered on a rocky, secluded island off the coast, surrounded by jagged cliffs and the vast, endless sea. The town nearest to the island was small, with only a handful of houses scattered along the shoreline. A tiny ferry operated infrequently, but aside from that, the island and its towering structure were left to the mercy of nature. It was the perfect place to disappear from the world for a while. As Tom made his way across the waves to the island for the first time, the journey seemed surreal. The salty air, the soft hum of the ferry cutting through the water, and the swaying of the boat made him feel like he was entering another world. The lighthouse loomed larger as he approached, its white paint chipped from years of exposure to salt and storms, but its presence still imposing against the backdrop of the churning sea. The beacon, dormant for years, stood silent. When the ferry docked and Tom stepped onto the rocky island, the first thing he noticed was the silence. No traffic, no chatter, just the wind, the crash of the waves against the rocks, and the occasional call of a seabird in the distance. He made his way to the lighthouse and settled into the small, austere keeper's quarters. The room was small, barely enough space for a bed, a desk, and a small wood stove. There were maps of the island pinned to the walls, weathered and faded. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. The place hadn't been inhabited for years, and it showed in the decaying wood and the faint smell of mildew that lingered in the air. That evening after unpacking, Tom took a walk around the lighthouse, trying to familiarize himself with his new home. The wind whipped around him, cold and biting, and the ocean seemed restless as the waves crashed against the cliffside. He stood at the edge of the rocks, looking out over the water, feeling small against the vastness of the sea. There was something tranquil about the place, but something else, too. Something unsettled. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Later that night, as the storm clouds gathered over the horizon and rain began to fall, Tom retired to the keeper's quarters. The howl of the wind and the rhythmic pounding of the waves below echoed through the walls, and the faint creaks of the old lighthouse gave an unsettling vibe, as though it were alive. It wasn't long before Tom heard it. At first it was just a faint thud, like something small falling on the stone floor. He turned his head, his heart skipping a beat. He stood still for a moment, straining to hear. There was nothing but the storm outside. He convinced himself it was just the wind or the building settling. But then, a louder noise came, this time from the stairwell leading up to the lantern room. A thud, followed by what sounded like a slow, dragging sound. It was faint, but it was there. Tom's pulse quickened as he grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the stairwell. He hesitated for a moment, but the need to investigate overpowered his fear. The beam of his flashlight illuminated the narrow staircase, winding upward toward the lantern room. As he climbed, the noise continued, now sounding like footsteps. Tom stopped midway, holding his breath, waiting for the next sound. His eyes darted around, but the beam of light revealed nothing but the empty stone walls. His mind raced, thinking of every possibility, but he found no answer. Just the storm, he whispered to himself. Just the wind. But when he reached the top, the light at the lantern room flickered. The air was colder than before, and the beam from the lighthouse cast strange shadows across the room. Tom stepped forward, his heart pounding. His fingers gripped the railing as he checked the light mechanism. Everything seemed fine, but the coldness lingered, pressing in on him. That night, Tom lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The wind howled outside, louder now, and the lighthouse creaked under the strain of the storm. His eyes flicked to the dark corners of the room, the shadows seeming to stretch unnaturally. Was it the storm playing tricks on him, or was it something else? Something he couldn't explain. The next morning, Tom went about his usual duties, checking the light, inspecting the oil, and making sure the beacon was functioning properly. But as he walked through the lighthouse, the strange feeling of being watched never left him. He checked every room, but no one was there. There was no explanation. That afternoon, while searching through the keeper's quarters for supplies, Tom stumbled upon something strange. An old journal tucked away in the back of a dusty drawer. It was leather-bound, yellowed with age, and the pages were filled with scribbled handwriting. Tom pulled it out, flipping through the entries. Most of it was mundane, listing daily weather conditions and logs of lighthouse maintenance. But as he got further into the pages, the entries grew more erratic. His heart raced as he read the following entry. I hear them now. They come from the sea. I feel them watching me, waiting. The fog rolls in thicker each night. They whisper in the dark, and I am afraid. I hear their voices in the wind, but I cannot leave. The light is my only protection. I must keep it shining. The sea will claim me if I let it go dark. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He flipped through more pages, the words growing more frantic and paranoid. The journal entries spoke of strange figures on the shore, shadows in the mist, and voices coming from the waves. The last entry, scrawled hastily across the page, sent a chill down Tom's spine. The light is dying. I cannot keep it up anymore. They are here, the Watchers. I can hear their footsteps on the stairs. The storm is coming. The sea will take me. It will take us all. Tom slammed the journal shut, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. He looked around the room, his eyes wide. The storm had been intensifying all day, and the wind was now howling through the lighthouse. The power flickered, casting the room into darkness before the light came back on. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the rocky cliffs, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fog, which had been rolling in thick all day, seemed to have a presence, as if it were alive. That night, Tom sat in the keeper's quarters, staring out of the window at the churning sea. His thoughts raced, wondering if he had made a mistake by coming here. Suddenly he heard it, the sound of footsteps on the stairs again, soft but deliberate. He jumped up, rushing toward the lantern room. As he reached the top, he looked out into the dark sea. The fog had thickened, and he could see nothing beyond the lighthouse's reach. But then, from the mist, a figure emerged. Tall and thin, cloaked in the fog, it stood just beyond the light's beam, its face hidden by the mist. It was as if the figure had been waiting for the light to reveal it. The figure moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the base of the lighthouse. Tom's heart pounded as the figure reached the stairs, its form blurry and indistinct. But Tom couldn't move. He was frozen, his eyes fixed on the figure as it slowly ascended the steps, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure reached the top, standing in front of Tom, who couldn't speak. It stepped forward, and Tom felt his body freeze. The figure reached out its hand, skeletal, ghostly, and Tom felt his heart stop. But before the figure could touch him, the lighthouse's light flickered out. The room plunged into darkness. The figure was gone. The storm outside raged as Tom stood, frozen, in the darkened lighthouse. The silence was deafening. He knew he was no longer alone.